I think there's another part of the discussion we need to have about the arts and how the arts can contribute. And I think just to add to that uncertainty about hazy definitions of place and so on and so forth, we're also living in a really interesting time where we talk about the changing role of local government, the changing role of local councils. Not just as a result of the financial squeeze that we're all experiencing, but also I think as a result of shifting expectations. Some of it driven by ministers, some of it driven by our dear friend Eric Pickles and some of his colleagues, but some of it driven by bottom-up expectations from the community as well. What's the council going to do for them? And I think, and I'll talk about the sort of changes I mean in a minute, and I think they're also there to be used by the arts to make a case for the arts being not a luxury, but essential to the role of councils, the contribution councils can make to communities going forward. And you guys in the arts need to understand that, know what's happening and know how to respond to this. Now, some of you will know some of this already, but I think if we start to join this with ideas of place and so on and so forth, we start to get a different picture of how the arts can work. I think there's 4 key things we should think about as the changing role, the changing expectations of councils. We are told, of course, we must do more for less. I mean, that's a mantra that's been around for some time, hasn't it? But the way we're interpreting that now is that we're not necessarily talking about doing more of the same. We're talking about thinking, well, what are we trying to achieve? And I'll come to that again. And are there different ways of doing things? So we've got less money to spend. Should we spend it in an entirely different way? Winchester, for example, and this is why it's slightly nerve-wracking for me as Winchester's chief executive to come to an audience like this. About 2 years ago, we deleted the post of our arts development officer. It was retirement time for the lady in question. She chose to go. So we thought we're not going to replace her. Now that's pretty Philistine, isn't it, really? What we did was we said, we'll take that money and we'll spend it differently. And I'll come to some of this again in a minute. We'll spend it on bringing somebody in to do a different job. And we actually took a bit of savings from that as well, but we spent our money differently. So we were doing, I think, arguably more for less by thinking about a different way of providing. And that brings me to the second phrase that we talk about. You will have heard this, the transformation of services. We must think about how we do things differently, rather than necessarily assuming that we should do it the same old way. And to ask that question, we have to use the third phrase. We in local government focus on outcomes. We are told we should focus on outcomes now. The difference you make for your community by doing something. The outcome of providing a planning service is not the fast or slow process of planning applications. It's whether you make a positive difference to the built environment. The outcome of a housing service is not how quickly you turn around voids or something like that. It's whether you're making sure that the people who are in need are housed in decent conditions. The outcome of economic development, perhaps a bit more obvious, is that we have a prosperous economy. Not that we open a number of business units or we do this or we do that. We talk in terms of the impact we have on our communities. Now, if you start joining up those 3 ideas, then if you're focusing on an outcome, you think, what are the different ways of achieving that? The best example I use of something we've done is actually not an arts or cultural example, although there were arts cultural elements. We had in a community in Winchester itself, in one of our council estates, a fairly localised problem with childhood obesity. And we thought, how are we going to tackle that? And there's all the usual things that councils, us and the county working together would have come up with. And we thought, no, we're not going to approach it that way. We're not going to do it that traditional way. What we will do instead is say, we have a certain amount of money and we want to bring in fresh ideas as to how we can do that. We commissioned a service, and that's language that's familiar to those working in certainly adult services, some areas, other areas as well. But potentially quite new for certain parts of councils. And by commissioning, we said, tell us how you organisations think we can achieve that. Tell us how you should transform services, how you can do more for less, how you can think differently about that problem. And we came up with a whole range of answers, from solutions which were about parental education, through to cookery lessons in schools, through to sports activity, and a few interestingly different, slightly off-the-wall ideas as well. And one of those, intriguingly, was a children's theatre group. The idea being it got them interested in activities, got them interested in other things, and created a different perception as to how they should use their leisure time. More active kids are healthier kids. So we started turning it round and saying, where can we do things differently and where can we spend that money? That's exactly what we did with our arts service as well. We commissioned our arts service. We said the outcome we want is a thriving and diverse cultural sector where small arts organisations, which is the backbone of what happens in Winchester, can be supported. And we sent somebody out to talk to them instead of doing what the council had traditionally done for years, commission bits of work and support odd bits of festivals and have quite constrained grants programmes. And we turned around the way we spent the remaining money on arts because of not employing another arts development officers. And I love arts development officers, they're wonderful people. I'm going to speak to their conference later this week, so I need to be careful what I say. But what we did was bring in somebody who wasn't thinking like a council officer, was thinking quite differently, and it worked. The fourth area, which I think starts to be really, really interesting for us, and I've picked this up from an erstwhile chief exec colleague of mine, a chap called Mel Asher, who used to be in South Somerset. He wrote something in the Municipal Journal not so long ago. He said, local government's role has changed. We don't provide services anymore, we solve problems. And Mel always sort of exaggerates to make a point. Of course, at some level we provide services. But our job increasingly is to solve problems that communities face. It's to do those little interventions here and there which will make something better, whether it's a problem with childhood obesity, kids who haven't got anything to do, older people who are in their homes and don't have any sort of social contact from day to day. Those are problems we have to solve. And if we start looking at things from the point of view of problem solving, the outcomes we want to achieve, the different ways of doing it, then the language really starts to shift. And that's, I think, where culture, the arts, really start to come into their own in being able to make a difference. They stop being the luxury, they start being an essential part of how we solve those problems, because when we think differently, we can see that arts, cultural activity, whatever you want to call it, can make a difference to your economy, to your isolated, vulnerable older people, to your inactive children, so on and so forth, in a way which perhaps traditionally we wouldn't have. We would have just pumped more money into an economic development officer or social workers or whatever it might be.